The Subcommittee of the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism will come to order without objection. Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point. All members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. We have been joined by the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Chairman Meeks. Thank you so much for being here. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with House Resolution 8 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. See that we have a quorum. We will now recognize I'll recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we are holding a hearing on human rights in Saudi Arabia. For decades, American presidents, both Democrats and Republicans, elevated human rights and advanced a values-based foreign policy, not because of altruism. Human rights and a principled foreign policy provided important advantages to the United States in strategic competition, and still does today. Competition with authoritarian rivals, from Putin's Russia to Khamenei's Iran to Xi's China. The U.S.-Saudi partnership, forged in the aftermath of the Second World War, is more than 3/4 of a century old. It has persisted for more than 75 years through very different eras, guided by very different kings and presidents, because the United States and Saudi Arabia do share important interests. Working constructively and honestly with Saudi Arabia can advance U.S. interests and stability both in the Middle East and globally. However, human rights are a longtime point of contention in our relationship, and I believe that we must always ensure human rights are at the forefront of our foreign policy. The cold-blooded murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi operatives in October 2018 and the Trump administration's response, which prioritized business opportunities over values, forced a reconsideration of the role that human rights play in U.S.-Saudi ties. The brutal murder of Khashoggi, a Washington Post journalist and Virginia resident in Mr. Connolly's district, was a rebuke to the values for which America stands, approved by the highest levels of the Saudi government. As the recently declassified U.S. intelligence report made known, the killing undermined Americans' confidence in our partnership with the kingdom and inflicted enormous damage on the bilateral relationship. Other recent Saudi actions have tested the relationship, including the arrest and alleged torture of women's rights activist Luhain al-Hafloul, who simply advocated for the right of Saudi women to drive. Luhain was recently released, but Saudi Arabia upheld her original sentence, so she still faces 3 years of probation in addition to her travel ban. Her probation also stipulates that anything perceived by Saudi authorities as political activism could result in rearrest. Saudi Arabia also imprisoned the blogger Raif Badawi, who is serving a 10-year sentence on bogus charges related to his writing and peaceful activism. Dr. Walid Fatahi, a U.S. citizen and medical doctor who worked to build bridges between his native and adopted countries, and was sentenced in December to 6 years in prison, and Dr. Badr al-Ibrahim, a journalist from northern Colorado who was targeted for his peaceful advocacy for social reforms. Saudi authorities also detained Salah al-Haidar, a writer and journalist, on baseless charges, and Aziza al-Yusuf, a women's rights activist who remains on provisional release. Both Mr. al-Haidar and Ms. al-Yusuf are constituents of our colleague, Mr. Connolly, and as I mentioned earlier, Jamal Khashoggi was also a resident of Mr. Connolly's Northern Virginia district, and I'd like to just take a moment to commend Mr. Connolly's tireless efforts his efforts on their behalf, and for his work to uphold human rights in Saudi Arabia and around the world. Saudi Arabia is a partner, but we cannot be afraid to speak truth to our partners. We cannot sacrifice American values, especially when certain actions threaten the foundation of a relationship that advances U.S. interests. And while I acknowledge and appreciate recent Saudi reforms that provide greater rights to women and will reform elements of the Saudi judicial system, the Saudi government must take additional actions to address American concerns about the treatment of our citizens and residents, must stop targeting Saudi dissidents and political activists, and must ensure fundamental human rights in the kingdom. 2.5 years after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, we must reinforce this message already delivered by broad bipartisan majorities in Congress. We have passed multiple bills and resolutions calling for accountability for the murder of Khashoggi, the release of unjustly detained American citizens and Saudi political prisoners, and an improved human rights environment in Saudi Arabia. Additional measures, which we will hear about today, have been introduced in recent weeks by our colleagues on this subcommittee. Our focus must be on building a more balanced, healthy, and principled relationship with the kingdom. President Biden understands the role of values in our approach to the world. In fact, he has spent nearly 50 years advocating and implementing a principled U.S. foreign policy. The president believes, and I quote, "The reason why we lead the world is not merely because we have the most powerful military in the history of the world. The reason we're followed is not because of the example of our power, but the power of our example, our value set. That's what's been able to persuade the world to move in the direction we want to move." Close quote. That's why the Biden administration recently declassified and released the American intelligence community's assessment of the Khashoggi murder. I commend the administration for taking this important and overdue step toward transparency, accountability, and justice for Jamal, including the State Department announcement of visa restrictions and the Treasury Department's announcement of sanctions. These actions make clear the United States will not tolerate gross human rights abuses, including the targeting of dissidents. But these actions should not be the last word. Congress must work with the Biden administration on this difficult but necessary process of recalibrating U.S.-Saudi relations and ensuring that the tenor of bilateral ties always reflect our values as well as our national interests. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their testimony. I look forward to discussing this issue, which is so critically important to U.S. foreign policy and to the protection of human rights around the world. And with that, I now yield to my friend from South Carolina, our ranking member, Joe Wilson, for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Ted Deutsch, for calling this important hearing on the status of human rights in Saudi Arabia, America's 75-year partner providing for stability in the Middle East. With Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's increased policy role in recent years, there's been a shift in messaging coming from the kingdom. The ongoing domestic initiatives of Vision 2030, an agenda aimed at diversifying revenue, increasing tourism, and presenting Saudi Arabia as a modern kingdom ready to do business around the globe, all are hailed as revolutionary. More still can be done, though, to accomplish the kingdom's goals of being accepted and being, again, a very appreciated ally of the United States. It seems that the image being portrayed to the world does not reflect the realities of life for the citizens of Saudi Arabia. The release of the declassified report by the Director of National Intelligence confirms that a team of operatives carried out the brutal murder of journalist and Saudi government critic Jamal Khashoggi, who was living in Virginia. In recent years, there's been increased use by the Specialized Criminal Court, officially designated to counterterrorism, to prosecute journalists, activists, and political dissidents. I hope our witnesses will speak to how the United States can use its policies to promote accountability for the past crimes and ongoing abuses. There have been positive developments regarding the rights of women, such as the reversal of the archaic ban on women driving, more ability for women to participate in social and cultural events, and some changes in guardianship policies. Small steps toward progress should be recognized. Sadly, these policies have been accompanied by an ongoing crackdown on activism and dissent. Reports by some female activists allege torture, imprisonment on arbitrary charges, and sexual abuse while detained. These abuses should be fairly investigated. For years, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has also pledged to address the issue of promoting extremist views toward religious minorities through its educational material. The Office of the International Freedom at the State Department and organizations have indicated that the textbooks in Saudi Arabia classrooms incite hatred and rejection of other religion. Phrases that explain jihad as, quote, a joined battle against disbelievers, end of quote, have been frequently found in Saudi textbooks. I was grateful to introduce the bipartisan H.R. 554, Saudi Educational Transparency and Reform Act in 2019, with the distinguished member of Congress from Massachusetts, Representative Bill Keating, to require an annual review of Saudi Arabia's textbooks, ensuring that there is full implementation of its commitment to reform. Also, a country seeking modernity must not be involved in propagating hate in its textbooks and sowing extremist sentiments in children. I appreciate that the witnesses here are before us today, and we were very grateful to have them here. Look forward to their perspectives. And it's also very important that we understand in the Middle East how important Saudi Arabia is standing firm against the murderous regime in Tehran, which has attacked the kingdom with rocket attacks over the last 2 years. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I'll now recognize the chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, Mr. Meeks. Chairman Meeks, we're glad to have you with us today for this important hearing. Honored by your presence, and you're recognized for any opening remarks you may have.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Chairman Deutsch, for holding this timely hearing and for your excellent opening statement, and I want to associate myself with it in its entirety. To our distinguished witnesses, I want to also thank you for your insights on this important topic. Saudi Arabia is a long-standing and critical U.S. partner in a complex and changing region. Our political, economic, and commercial interests intersect in important ways, and many of our regional goals align. These goals are essential to the security of our country and that of our closest allies, and must be pursued together. Nonetheless, for far too long, Saudi Arabia's routine suppression of basic rights and free expression has gone unaddressed. From the lack of religious freedoms and minority rights to the active suppression of public debate, free speech, and the criminalization of dissent, such actions are a thorn in the side of this important bilateral relationship. Though Saudi Arabia has taken steps towards reform, such as granting women the right to drive and obtain travel documents, recent years have been marred by Saudi's government's brutality against dissidents, most notably the detention and abuse of numerous peaceful protesters and a brutal killing of the Washington Post journalist and U.S. resident Jamal Khashoggi. Despite overwhelming evidence of the Saudis' government's role in this murder, the previous administration did little to ensure our relationship with Saudi Arabia remained consistent with American values. In contrast, the Biden administration's release of the DNI report was a good step towards accountability for the killing of Mr. Khashoggi. Finally, following a bipartisan legal requirement the previous administration refused to comply with for over 1 year. Now, I look forward to the witnesses' testimony today and will close with this thought. We can and should maintain a strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia while being firm and clear about our values as a country, especially when it comes to the targeting of journalists, political dissidents, and the imprisonment of U.S. citizens. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Chairman Meeks. I will now introduce our distinguished witnesses. Ms. Suzanne Nossel is Chief Executive Officer at PEN America. She previously served as Chief Operating Officer of Human Rights Watch, Executive Director of Amnesty International USA. She also served in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, leading U.S. engagement in the UN and multilateral institutions on human rights issues, and in the Clinton administration as Deputy to the U.S. Ambassador for UN Management and Reform. She is the author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Dr. Hala Aldosari is Scholar of Social determinants of health and gender-based violence research. She examines the influence of gender norms on women's political, economic, legal, and health statuses in the Arab Gulf states. Dr. Aldosari has worked as a biomedical scientist, a consultant for the Ministry of Health of Saudi Arabia, and as a lecturer of health sciences. She's been selected for fellowships and scholar residencies at multiple top universities, and she was the Washington Post's first Jamal Khashoggi Fellow. And Ms. Kirsten Fontenrose is the director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Previously, she served as senior director for the Gulf at the National Security Council, leading the development of U.S. policy toward the GCC, Yemen, Egypt, and Jordan. Her interagency experience includes 5 years at the State Department, leading the Middle East and Africa team in their interagency Global Engagement Center. And she spent a year in the private sector consulting on specialized projects in the national security space. Thanks to all of the witnesses for being here today. I will now recognize witnesses for 5 minutes each, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made a part of the record. Ms. Nossel, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch and Ranking Member Wilson, for convening this timely hearing. PEN America unites writers and their allies to celebrate creative expression and defend the liberties that make it possible. We're grateful for the opportunity to testify today on the ongoing assault on human rights and free expression in Saudi Arabia. PEN America has been vocal and active in advocating for justice following the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. In 2019, we awarded our PEN Barbie Freedom to Write Award to Saudi women's rights activists and writers Nouf Abdelaziz, Iman Al-Nafjan, and Loujain Al-Hathloul. We recognize them for their fearless work exposing the deprivations of Saudi's infantilizing guardianship system over women and launched a global campaign for their freedom. While the recent conditional release of Hathloul and several other Saudi writers and women's rights activists is welcome, it must not blind us to the ongoing reality of sustained repression. Legal harassment, detention, and the threat of execution constrict the freedoms of those who dare speak out on sensitive subjects. Even those released are far from free, subject to travel bans, surveillance, and the risk of renewed imprisonment. The regime's determination to hunt down dissenters instills a sense of fear from which there is no escape, even far beyond Saudi borders. Saudi Arabia has long been one of the most restrictive countries in the world for human rights, including freedom of expression in the press. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is sometimes described as a modernizer, but his updated policies and practices must not be mistaken for true liberalization, much less any commitment to human rights. The Crown Prince has sought to consolidate his shaky hold on power by pairing social reforms popular with young Saudis with an intensifying crackdown on dissent and free speech. Measures to loosen restrictions on dress, entertainment, social media, and women's autonomy have been paired with a clampdown on the country's most potent rights advocates and dissenters. Loujain Al-Hathloul is a striking example. Women were granted permission to receive driver's licenses in June of 2018. But just weeks prior, she and others who had campaigned for years to secure this freedom were arrested, entering a nearly 3-year legal odyssey involving incommunicado detention and torture. The Crown Prince claimed glory for lifting the unpopular ban on driving, but went to extreme lengths to prevent those who had championed the cause from receiving credit or moving on to wage new fights for rights. Further waves of arrests of writers and activists in April and November of 2019 evinced utter imperviousness to international outcry in the wake of the Khashoggi murder. The present moment represents a critical juncture to reorient U.S. policy on Saudi Arabia, making good on President Biden's promise to tip the scales in the direction of human rights. Saudi Arabia also represents an essential proving ground for an administration that aims to restore the U.S.'s legitimacy and leadership on human rights worldwide. Prisoner releases within weeks of President Biden's inauguration demonstrate the leverage the administration can wield if it chooses to do so. After taking the crucial step of releasing the DNI report, the decision to spare the Crown Prince from sanction in order to protect other facets of the U.S.-Saudi relationship risks overshadowing the administration's rhetoric and actions in the name of accountability. These include, importantly, the creation of a global Khashoggi ban, allowing visa restrictions for officials responsible for extraterritorial attacks on journalists. Robust further measures are now essential to ensure that neither Saudi Arabia nor the rest of the world are left with the impression that the US's commitment to human rights and press freedom will be traded away when the stakes are highest. The Crown Prince must face meaningful personal consequences for having directed a crime that shocked the conscience of the world. Otherwise, the shroud of untouchability shielding not just him, but other abusive autocrats with whom the US does business will stiffen, with grave implications for global press freedom, free expression, and human rights. Congress should pass several bills that have been introduced to advance accountability for human rights violations in Saudi Arabia. These include the Saudi Arabia Accountability for Gross Violations of Human Rights Act, introduced by Representatives Malinowski, McGovern, and Kim, the Protection of Saudi Dissidents Act, reintroduced this year by Representative Connolly, and the Jamal Khashoggi Press Freedom Accountability Act, introduced by Representative Schiff and Senator Klobuchar. As for the Biden administration, it should make good on its view, voiced during the campaign, that it would be necessary to seek, quote, a set of pledges from the Saudi government to ensure atrocities like the Khashoggi murder do not recur. They should make clear that such progress is a condition of future stable partnership with the US, including in particular if the Crown Prince is to become king. The Biden administration's commitment to rejoin the UN Human Rights Council presents one vehicle. Saudi Arabia has been a member of the Council for 12 of the last 15 years since it was created in 2006. In running for election to the Council, the Kingdom has pledged to consider joining key human rights treaties and cooperating with UN human rights mechanisms. But so far, these have been empty promises. In 2020, their candidacy was thankfully defeated in what the Kingdom considered an embarrassing blow. The Biden administration and the US Congress should now push Saudi Arabia to adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, key human rights instruments that Saudi Arabia has never joined. Saudi Arabia should be pressed to permit entry by UN special procedures to carry out their work within country and to establish a UN Office for Human Rights in the Kingdom that would help implement and assess planned legal and judicial reforms and advance further measures to uphold rights. Lujain al-Hathul's sister Lena shared these words with us. Lujain was released thanks to international pressure, and the fight for her should not end here. Lujain is a symbol of Saudi Arabia's human rights defenders, and giving up on her now is giving up on the fight for freedom. We thank the many members of Congress who have raised their voices on behalf of writers, activists, and other human rights defenders in Saudi Arabia. It makes a difference, and we must keep up and step up the fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nossel. Dr. Aldosari, welcome back to the subcommittee, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the distinguished members of the House for organizing this important event and for including my voice and voices in the region in your deliberation. I present my statement here as a citizen of Saudi Arabia who was forced into exile because of my advocacy for women and human rights in my country. I'm one of hundreds of Saudis, scholars, activists who were forced in the last few years to seek refuge in other countries because of their writings or demands for reforms. Saudi Arabia has become one of the most repressive countries while pursuing certain legal reforms. The brutal murder, as mentioned, of Jamal Khashoggi has actually revealed the reality on the ground. Human rights in Saudi Arabia are severely limited because of the absolute monarchical system of governance. There is no political parties, independent media, associational life for the civil society, or any other means for peaceful, safe public engagement in political affairs. The Royal Advisory Council is made up of appointed members without legislative or oversight power. Only 2/3 of the municipal council seats are open for election, and candidates are routinely disqualified if they were engaged in any public discourse on reforms. While activists and advocates for reforms are routinely targeted and silenced, the situation has become more aggressive, both in scope and severity, since the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman came to power in 2017. Several waves of arrest, as mentioned by my other colleagues, have targeted people of different backgrounds, religious reformers, bloggers, businessmen, statesmen, members of the ruling family, and men and women activists. under various pretexts like fighting political Islam, corruption, or treason. The Presidency of State Security, established by Mohammed bin Salman in 2017, reports directly to court or to Mohammed bin Salman with the authority of utilizing any institutional resources or manpower to conduct its operations without any kinds of judicial oversight. Testimonies of several detained individuals indicate an alarming use of torture to coerce confessions or to seize personal assets. Laws on counterterrorism and cybersecurity are repeatedly cited in targeting peaceful advocates for reforms. In his 2018 mission report, the Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedom while countering terrorism expressed his concern that confessions obtained under torture were admissible in the in the specialized criminal court, and this is a court often used to try activists and advocates for reforms. He also noted that there were 3,000 allegations of torture were formally recorded, but without any kinds of persecution of officials involved. There are no safeguards against torture or ill treatment, and most individuals are held incommunicado for extended periods of time. We've learned only from those who were recently released or the relatives of those who were detained about the different forms of torture used and how systematic it became as part of the state investigation. Electric shock, waterboarding, severe beating, starvation, sleep deprivation were common practices in Saudi interrogation. In addition, the women activist has also been exposed to sexual abuse and threats of rape and killing. They all have pointed to the role of the masked individual from the state presidency security, and for individuals such as Saud al-Qahtani, who is an advisor, a close advisor of Mohammed bin Salman, and who has been cleared from any kinds of responsibility in the Khashoggi's killing. So despite the legal reforms to ease the restrictions on women's autonomy and women mobility, women remain vulnerable to discrimination and abuse. These reforms do not protect women from their guardians asking for, revoking any kinds of rights because of disobedience or absence from home. Sponsorship system remains problematic despite the reforms that has been in effect. And we, as people, have come together to establish a vision for reform that puts people in exile, Saudi people in exile, have put a people vision for reform that centers human rights and social justice as key measures or benchmarks for any meaningful reforms. And I thank you. I don't want to speak more, but we can definitely discuss this at length in questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aldosari. Ms. Fontenrose, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Deutsch, Chairman Meeks, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for your attention to and interest in shaping the future of the U.S.-Saudi relationship. The U.S. has an opportunity now at the start of an administration that has made it clear that the U.S.-Saudi relationship will be recalibrated to set a course for the bilateral that protects and advances both human rights and U.S. strategic interests. The administration's vow to apply global Magnitsky sanctions to employees of the kingdom who threaten Saudi activists abroad is a step in the right direction. Likewise is the travel visa ban on Khashoggi, or the Khashoggi ban, though it is a downside in the eyes of human rights attorneys we can discuss later if you're interested. Diplomatically, President Biden's choice to limit Mohammed bin Salman or MBS's access within the U.S. government to his official role as Minister of Defense sends an important deterrent message in the service of human rights. Not treating MBS as de facto head of state implies that the Crown Prince would not be safe from prosecution in American courts. Examples from recent years indicate that U.S. pressure can result in policy changes in the kingdom within certain lanes. U.S. urging helped lead to reforms passed in 2019 to allow women to drive and travel abroad independently and to end flogging as a criminal punishment. And as mentioned previously, U.S. pressure obtained the release of Loujain el-Hathout. The State Department has encouraged the kingdom's efforts to remove hate speech from its school curriculum since 2015. A new version was released last year, perhaps in response to legislation sponsored by Congressman Wilson. One reality check, however, the U.S. recently lost a point of leverage with MBS by releasing the unclassified ODNI report on the murder of Jamal Khashoggi so early in the administration. A delay in the report's release might have yielded additional concessions to U.S. asks. In the bilateral relationship, the U.S.'s position is arguably stronger than the kingdom's, but the U.S. is still wise to weigh the cost of its policy decisions. Sanctioning MBS could lead to calls for sanctioning Chinese President Xi Jinping, Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, for ordering and overseeing the abuses that make China and Iran #1 and #2 respectively on the UN's list of the world's worst human rights abusers in 2020, ahead of Saudi Arabia's slightly less egregious position as #5. Sanctioning the Crown Prince is unlikely to create support for replacing him as heir apparent. After members of Congress spoke angrily in December 2018 about MBS's role in the Khashoggi killing, third-party pollsters in Saudi Arabia registered rising support for the Crown Prince amongst young adults, his base, who are more than half of the population. U.S. actions targeting Mohammed bin Salman personally with the implied aim of impacting his chances for ascension could draw retaliation from Saudi Arabia on multiple fronts. These might include reductions in foreign direct investment in the U.S., increased cooperation with China on nuclear energy, refusal to normalize with Israel, refusal to contribute to expensive regional stabilization projects that will be U.S. priorities, support to Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria, continuation of the war in Yemen, or undermining of President Biden's energy transition agenda. It's important to understand that at the root of human rights abuses perpetrated by Saudi Arabia are issues perceived as existential by the increasingly narrow circle of decision makers in the royal family. Whether this perception is accurate or not, if Riyadh's calculus indicates that a U.S. ask will cause regime vulnerability, it will not be met. New methods are necessary. I offer 4 pages of options in my written testimony, but for now I would like to stress 2 overarching pieces that would increase the odds of any U.S. policy actuating change in Saudi Arabia. First, clearly defined red lines and consequences for violating them. The U.S. administration bears the baggage of the Obama red line on the use of chemical weapons in Syria in 2012, but actionable tiers of red lines with proportional responses could reduce the likelihood of the kingdom calling the U.S. bluff. Second, an internationalized response to Saudi human rights violations like the Khashoggi murder. Citizens of multiple nations are victims of human rights abuses at the hands of Saudi actors, and there is no need for the U.S. bilateral relationship to be the sacrificial lamb. I propose for your consideration instead an international convention against harassment and harm of political dissidents abroad that commits all signatories to enact sanctions or take other steps together against violators. In closing, I'd like to note that the kingdom is a linchpin for nearly every U.S. objective in the region and some beyond. Drawing down our military footprint, expanding and deepening Arab-Israeli normalization, preventing the resurgence and spread of violent extremist groups, ending the war in Yemen, containing Iranian nuclear and regional ambitions, preventing adversarial great power domination of the resources and waterways of the region, ensuring the flow of energy to fuel American lives and industry, stabilizing post-conflict zones so populations in countries racked by war can begin to rebuild their lives, and energy transition and decarbonization. U.S. goals in the Middle East are best served by remaining closely engaged with the government of Saudi Arabia, adopting an approach that is part boot camp instructor, part parole officer, and part avuncular advisor. Demographic trends indicate that Saudi will look very different in 10 to 20 years. That can allow for a new political model. An alienated Saudi Arabia will not get there by itself. It is in the U.S. interest to shepherd that potential, lead course correction, and build a better partner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fontenrose. Thanks to all of you for your testimony today. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes each pursuant to House rules. All time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we will circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. We will start and I will yield to my friend from New York first, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Gregory Meeks, for any questions that he may have. Chairman Meeks, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask Ms. Nossel, the Trump administration rarely raised difficult issues with the Saudis. And the United States must grapple with the question of how to address actions by partners and countries which conflict with who we are as a country, with our basic values. So now, given the lack of effective response to public statements drawing attention to the Saudi human rights violations, what do you view as the most effective way that the United States can encourage changes in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia?
I agree with you that the United States has leverage, must use its leverage. I think it's a combination of measures, both public and private. I think it needs to be made clear that the future of this relationship depends upon demonstrable, durable progress. I think it's very important to distinguish between that really an attempt some greater support among the Saudi population and particularly the youth in order to stabilize the monarchy and protect against any sort of public uprising and tamp down on opposition. So taking certain measures to sort of twist the valve and release some of the pressure that would otherwise build up. Things like allowing women permission to drive, loosening some of the strictures of the guardianship system, allowing some more access to social media. But I think the United States needs to make clear that it's not deceived into thinking that this is a liberalization agenda that's simply, on its way and it's going to lead inexorably to greater freedom over time. I think it's quite the opposite. I think it's a deliberate two-pronged strategy to, on the one hand, modernize and satisfy some of that public pressure, and perhaps also window dressing in terms of global perceptions of the kingdom. But that is being paired with this intensifying crackdown that is worsening the situation for freedom of expression, making life even more difficult and risky for dissidents. And so I think the United States needs to be candid about sort of seeing through that. I think there's been a wish to look at the modernization measures as sort of steps in the right direction. And if we can just encourage more of that, we'll be on our way. I don't think that's accurate. I think we need a candid discussion about the imperative of concrete measures. I think we need to take steps of our own to ensure that they recognize we take these issues seriously and we're prepared to take some risks in the relationship on behalf of human rights. But we also have to insist that the Saudi government commit to tangible steps. And there are all sorts of things they know. It's releasing dissidents. It's not imprisoning additional people. It's allowing the kind of discourse online that was flourishing a few years ago, but now has been brutally muzzled and suppressed. And so, I think there are a variety of levels. I agree with the idea of multilateralizing that pressure and engaging others in applying it. So it's not just the United States alone. I think the Human Rights Council in Geneva can provide an important vehicle for that.
So what about, there's been issues and questions going along as far as accountability is concerned, particularly in light of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. Are there any other actions, do you think, that you would view as appropriate to ensure accountability and positive steps for reform that can be done here?
Yes, I think the two really need to be paired. I think when it comes to accountability, the obvious glaring gap is with respect to MBS himself. I understand the dilemma that the administration faces and the other equities that are at work in the relationship. But I do think this is a situation where no matter the other measures enacted, some of which I think have been forceful and very positive, the application of the Magnitsky sanctions, the global Khashoggi ban, and the application of that to 76 Saudis who are implicated not just in the Khashoggi case, but in attacks and plots against other dissidents around the world. So positive steps, but I think the rubber hits the road when it comes to MBS. And if the perception is that he's gotten off scot-free, that unravels the whole notion and concept of accountability in this case. And so I think it's extremely important that he not be welcomed back into diplomatic good graces anytime soon, that if and when he is, it is in response to concrete, measurable, visible, and irreversible steps that we can point to say, this is a different era and the pressure worked, and he's been prompted, and the monarchy has been prompted to do things they would not otherwise have done. I think the measures I referenced in my statement, the congressional measures, including Representative Malinowski's important proposal to impose a travel ban, that would signify that the buck stops where it should stop and not several steps down, which is sort of the, I think the perception in light of where things are today. I do think, as you say, it's not just about accountability for the Khashoggi murder, as important as that is. I think it has to go further and address the broader climate of brutal repression of free expression. That's what Jamal Khashoggi lived for and ultimately died for. And so if we don't reach beyond, this current question of accountability for this horrific, heinous deed, the legacy and the forces that brought it about will survive intact. And so I don't think we can count that as a success. And that's why I think we need to press for these more systemic changes.
Thank you so very much. I'm out of time. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you, Chairman Meeks. Next, we'll go to Ranking Member Wilson. Mr. Wilson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here today, an indication of how important their testimony is, how fortunate we are to have Chairman Greg Meeks participate. And so this truly indicates how important this issue is. And I have a question for each of our three witnesses, and that is, how strongly is Saudi Arabia motivated to differentiate itself from Iran on human rights? On what human rights issues do you see the most potential for behavior to change due to this motivation? And any of the witnesses?
Well, I can talk about that. Saudi Arabia is more committed to being part of the global movement, basically, of modernization, global movement to fight radical Islams or radical movement, more so than Iran on that front. And this presents a leverage for the US and democratic countries to utilize, to lead by example, to push for more democratic change or transformation in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia seems to be keen very much to be a hub for international business, to open the country for tourists. These are all things that you don't really see in Iran, and they're very much like closed off country and different in those kinds of issues. So I think that the leverage of global business values, global tourism, being part of those democratic countries, these are all leverages that can be used to reform certain issues inside Saudi Arabia, and more so in political reforms to democratic change, which is the only, I would say, a safeguard against excesses of abuses that we're seeing and witnessing from the state.
Either other witness, any comment? But thank you, that was right on point.
I would add that according to Human Rights Watch, the use of capital punishment declined in 2020 to 8% of the 2019 numbers, whereas Iran in the same year carried out the death penalty 15 times as often as did Saudi Arabia. This is not what the US can claim credit for, but we assess that it was Saudi's need to differentiate itself from Iran in ways that are meaningful to Europe that may have played a role here. And I would think that the areas we're seeing the most acceptance by Saudi in terms of making changes in human rights are women's issues and in terms of religious tolerance and religious freedoms. We are on the cusp of Saudi normalizing with Israel. It will probably be after a change in top leadership, but that will happen. And these are places where the US can take credit for applying the pressure that has made a difference. There's quite a bit of leverage that the US has in this relationship. Our military presence, the presence of our expats. We have tens of thousands of people living in Saudi Arabia, and they're very aware, to my co-panelist's point about economic incentives, that if the US multinational corporations pull their people, other multinationals will follow, and this will very negatively impact Saudi Arabia's economic landscape. We also have leverage in terms of our court system, which I alluded to, our troop presence, arming and equipping of their security services, our intelligence sharing. There are many levers the US can play with here.
Yeah, I mean, just to add briefly, I think the Saudi participation in UN human rights mechanisms, and they're seeking out of a seat on the Human Rights Council 4 times, is indicative of what my colleagues are talking about, which is this desire to be recognized on the world stage, to win diplomatic acceptance, to be welcomed in the corridors of power, which is something that operates very different. You don't see that with Iran. They have, positioned themselves as an international outlier with certain alliances, but certainly not in the good graces of the West. And I think Saudi is very much seeking that acceptance, and it is a crucial point of leverage. I think MBS is emblematic of that, in a very conflicted way. But it's clear he wants to be part of the club on the global stage, and so making very explicit what the conditions and imperatives are, if he is ever going to attain that status, I think is important. I think my colleagues are correct in terms of identifying the areas like women's rights, certain religious freedoms, where there's more leeway. These legal and judicial reforms that have now been proposed to extend right to counsel, greater transparency in legal proceedings are important. Now, there is a fundamental problem, though, which is that this monarchy is shaky and MBS's ascension is shaky. And as long as that remains true, ultimately their willingness to tolerate dissent is not going to is going to be very limited, because he recognizes that twisting the valve and allowing people to speak out and question what is being done and the decisions that are being taken, the legitimacy of his rule, whether he's qualified to be in the position he's in, all of those debates are existential for him. And so I think we have to be sort of forthright that yes, making progress on women's rights is essential. It could ultimately burgeon into something wider, but at the same time, there is that kind of fundamental disconnect between sort of the instability of the regime and the fragility of it, and the unwillingness to tolerate dissent.
Thank you all, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. Next, we will go to Mr. Connolly. Mr. Connolly, I said earlier I wasn't sure that you were on, but let me just say again that the work that we're doing on this on so many issues, but on this topic specifically, is informed in large part by your advocacy, your leadership, your work on behalf of Jamal Khashoggi and your other constituents protecting Saudi dissidents, your legislation. Thank you for all that you do for us and for the focus on human rights around the world, in Saudi Arabia in particular. And I'll now recognize you for 5 minutes.
Mr. Deutsch, thank you so much. What gracious remarks, and what a great way to begin my day. So thank you so much. And thank you for having this hearing. Ms. Fontenrose, I want to use two words here. One is impunity, and the other is leverage. We just heard how shaky, in a sense, the monarchy is, and yet we look at a Saudi government that I think for decades has operated with impunity with respect to the United States relationship. They know that the oil relationship, the arms sale relationship, the strategic posture of Saudi Arabia as a counter pressure point to the Iranians, and to giving the nod now and then to the Israeli relationship, are all so important that we're going to have to overlook bad behavior. And for me, the Chairman Deutsch just mentioned, of course, the unbelievable, despicable murder of my constituent, an American resident, Jamal Khashoggi, and the dismemberment of it. And the word impunity comes to mind. The fact that anyone would even think to plan such a thing would suggest, I'm pretty sure we're going to get away with it. And frankly, in the Trump administration, they did. And I am worried that the Biden administration has made a calculated assessment that says the relationship is too important to just junk it. And I certainly don't know that that's our only option. So how do we counter the impunity we're dealing with? And could we use the fact that there are, there's instability in the royal family, including a lot of resentment against the crown prince? Could we use that to advantage to make him an unacceptable choice as heir to the throne, and use our leverage for once in a meaningful and significant way? Or is that a stretch too far from your point of view? I mean, sanctions and travel bans and all that are very useful, but I don't know that they get to the impunity I'm talking about. your observations.
I agree with your assessment on the impunity, and it really is at the very top levels. We hear quite often from our interlocutors at senior levels and below in Saudi Arabia that they understand that this is a problem for us. This is certainly not an impunity that we see across the board in the Saudi government. But I do think we have to be careful, because at a certain point, when we talk about using our leverage to influence decision-making on succession in Saudi Arabia, we start to sound like we're talking about regime change. And that's not a game that the US wants to get into. Again, we don't tend to do it very well. But there are some ways that we can change some of the decision-making at the top that would impact this impunity. Mohammed bin Salman is surrounded by an echo chamber right now. He only hears good news, and they continue to sponsor campaigns of disinformation and misinformation globally and here that are intended to spread a narrative about how wonderful things are in Saudi, how suitable he is as a ruler. And while that's not all entirely false, it's certainly an indication that that impunity remains, and that we have not really seen a mea culpa that we were looking for. Part of this is his inner circle. There are a lot of wise advisors in Saudi Arabia who were replaced in recent years. These were people we trusted, people we've worked with for decades, and people who understand both how the global system works and understand America's values and our priorities. Those folks aren't there in the numbers we'd like to see. And one of my colleagues already mentioned a specific person, Saad al-Qahtani, who both the intelligence community and the policy community assessed was instrumental in some of the negative decisions that came out of the kingdom, not only the Jamal Khashoggi murder, which we assess he orchestrated and masterminded, but also in many other negative decisions, like civilian targeting in Yemen, like the standoffs with Canada and with Germany, like the interrogations in the Ritz. Saad Qahtani is sort of the odd jobs to Mohammed bin Salman's Goldfinger, and he tells him what he wants to hear. He keeps him very safe. He is not loyal to any other member of the royal family or to any other business interest, because he does not come from a prominent family or a competing branch of the royal family. And that makes him incredibly loyal and therefore incredibly dangerous to our interests. He was removed from his place at the elbow of the crown prince previously, but as my colleague mentioned, when he went through a court proceeding, he was found not guilty. At the time, I wrote an article saying that this finding of him as not guilty was actually a dent in the US-Saudi relationship, and that we would take it quite seriously. He is someone we need to make sure is removed from the decision-making circle in Saudi Arabia. And if that means stating a red line, then that means stating a red line. Saudi at one point even tried to tell us that he was dead. I mean, the disinformation to protect his role as the Mohammed bin Salman whisperer has been notable. And there are things we could do. We could ask for some of our favorite interlocutors to be reinstated. We could embed advisors, much as we do in many other nations, to help with the drafting of legislation that would protect human rights. We can encourage them to build out their national security agency, which is actually their equivalent of our NSC, which they made a real effort to build, but because of stovepipes and because of personality politics in Saudi Arabia, it's really just been this sort of administrative function. We can work with them, hold their hands to say, this is how you do interagency collaboration, interagency coordination of policy in such a way that only vetted ideas reach your senior decision maker, and not these crazy ideas that come from people without the policy or the international affairs knowledge to be making these kinds of recommendations. So there's some very practical things.
Very helpful. Unfortunately, my time is up, and the chairman's been gracious in allowing us to continue. But I think bottom line, the United States needs to approach this relationship with boldness and fortitude. Thank you for your suggestions. Very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Perry, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just curious, based on my good friend Representative Connolly's questioning for Ms. Fontenrose, are there better options? I mean, is there any realistic option other than MBS regarding the leadership in Saudi Arabia? I mean, is there any reason for us to really be, I mean, do we have any other option, or is that the best it's going to get?
The issue really is that this branch of the royal family has been consolidating power for quite some time. Previously, Saudi would power share across branches of the royal family. But in recent years, this has gone almost entirely to the branch of the family headed by current King Salman. So what this means is that when you look around for other options, you're looking at people who do not have a lot of decision-making power right now. You're also looking at the fact that Mohammed bin Salman has consolidated his control over all of the security services and over the finances of most of the royal princes. So if they were to perhaps speak out against him, their families could potentially be destitute and they could perhaps find themselves in jail. So we have to ask ourselves, are there people we'd be willing to back in any way, not only in a, as a potential replacement for Mohammed bin Salman, but also what would that do to Saudi politics writ large? What would that do to the power sharing among the branches of the royal family? Are we willing to talk about regime change in any realistic way? Do we even have the legal authority to do that? And would we be willing to ask Saudi friends to put their own lives and financial security at risk to spearhead something like that conversation? We've realized in recent years that national sovereignty and national succession are places that we can have opinions on, but it's best that we not actually put our finger on.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like whether we like it or not, agree with him or not, that whether he's moving quickly enough or not, or whatever our disagreements are, we're gonna have to work with him and resign ourselves to that fact. Is he particularly sensitive to international condemnation from the United States regarding Khashoggi or anybody else? And just as a curiosity of mine, what is his viewpoint or the ruling faction's viewpoint on the Muslim Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia?
Mohammed bin Salman is confused by why the US and the Western world are so upset about the Khashoggi killing. They understand that the way it was conducted is heinous. Most Saudis are as appalled as we are. But I will quote a conversation I had with a very senior Saudi representative who said, when I speak to Saudis about the Khashoggi murder, they ask, why is America so upset about this when Jeffrey Epstein died in government custody? That causes all of us to kind of drop our jaws, but that is very realistically, it's a state-controlled media, and as I mentioned, there is an echo chamber. So while Mohammed bin Salman is very sensitive to the discussions of Khashoggi, he does believe that this is an issue that can be dealt with, and that it will not necessarily create a dent in the U.S.-Saudi relationship if they can just do enough other things, but none of those things that are related to human rights. You'll notice that they've done quite a bit in terms of climate change just since inauguration. They're really trying to be a great US partner and kind of erase this memory. But to my co-panelist point, there are things we could be doing to press the human rights issue and make it more directly aligned. To your question on the Muslim Brotherhood, the Saudi regime is extremely opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood. They do consider the Brotherhood an existential threat to regime stability and to the royal family writ large. So the Brotherhood is probably their number one threat, I would say, equal to, and in some cases above, Iran.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and I think there's a connection with Khashoggi in that regard as well. But I do agree with your point, regarding the other measures that Saudi has taken. And I'm thinking just most recently regarding COVAX. But as you also stated, it does not absolve them of. I mean, I think they're number 5 on the list of human rights abusers. Just downstream from China and Iran, essentially North Korea, et cetera. So they've got a lot of work to do, and I think that we absolutely need to make that a focal point. At the same time, I think that we have very, very difficult issues to deal with in Iran and China and so on and so forth. And I don't want to see the committee, and this is not your bailiwick, but completely focused on Saudi Arabia here. But I did listen to some of the other things that you had said that we could leverage regarding Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses. And I think we need to do that on every single occasion and keep pressing. And while we probably acknowledge things like the good work on COVAX, we absolutely need to bring up the point every single time that the human rights abuses are unacceptable and that we're going to keep highlighting them and we're going to keep pursuing them. I think you've given us a pretty good list, so I don't want to talk for the sake of talking. I appreciate your time here and everybody's time here, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Perry. Mr. Cicilline, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I really want to thank you for your leadership and calling this really important hearing, and also acknowledge the incredible leadership of Mr. Conley for so long on this issue. And I think, as you described in your opening remarks, this is a challenge for us to ensure that we have foreign policy that reflects our values. And I think when you look at the backsliding of democracy and the rise of authoritarian leadership around the world, maybe this is there's no place where it's more clear than here in Saudi Arabia how challenging this is. But when you look at the age of the Saudi population, under the age of 25, half of the population is in that age group, and the looming ascent of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, this is a very important time for us to figure out how we both hold the Saudis accountable for their human rights record, but also ensure that we can maintain a productive relationship. And I think this is a great challenge. Ms. Nossel, I want to begin with you. And that is, my first question is, how urgent is this issue with respect to the suppression of dissent or the inability to criticize the kingdom in any way for the average Saudi? Is it a real issue, and is it bubbling up to be something that could cause real change in the kingdom? And second part of the question is, can you recommend any specific achievable kind of free expression reforms that the U.S. might be able to press for in its engagement with the Saudis?
Sure. I would say it's hard to know exactly. Of course, there are no really reliable public opinion polls that are conducted within Saudi Arabia. There isn't free media. There's repression online, such that it's hard to reliably gauge how important this issue is to the man on the street. And I think the strategy that MBS has undertaken is to address certain issues, the ban on driving being at the top of the list, the loosening of the guardianship restrictions that have kind of across the board support. I mean, that women's rights agenda is something that cuts across ideology, religious sectarianism, geography within Saudi Arabia. It has a lot of support in many quarters. And so I think that's why we have seen progress in that area. And I think, the strategy really is to take other steps that will appease a kind of pent-up demand for more freedom. But in order to be able to sustain this very intense, tight control over expression and dissent. And it's a kind of a bargain. I think it's important to recognize that. It's not sort of a progression where one will inexorably lead to the other. You address women's rights, and then there'll be liberalization when it comes to free expression and dissent. I think it's actually the two issues play off one another, and that in a sense, the Crown Prince is buying himself some support to continue this crackdown. And when it comes to certain officials who are more controversial,
I appreciate that. I just want to try to get in one more question, if you could. I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I want to try to get in one more question.
Sure.
And that is, there's been a lot of reporting and this is from Ms. Fontenrose, there's been a lot of reporting that Saudi Arabia is using hacking and social media surveillance to spy on and intimidate dissidents. In November 2019, U.S. authorities charged 2 former Twitter employees for spying on users on behalf of Saudi Arabia. And so, Ms. Fontenrose, how does technology fit into Saudi efforts to harass and intimidate activists and political opponents? And how can Congress ensure U.S. firms and technology are not being used in these efforts?
Technology is its primary tool in tracking and suppressing opposition. And the person I mentioned, Saad al-Qahtani, was instrumental in building Saudi Arabia's arsenal of these technological tools and continues to be. And we also note that Saudi Arabia went to the level of even harassing the CEO of a major U.S. corporation with this technique. The way that this can be handled is already underway. Congress and the U.S. government and most of the social media companies are involved in really in-depth discussions about where the limits of their authorities are and how much they can actually do in terms of personal freedoms. One of the challenges is that since many of these companies are US-based, we allow quite a bit more in terms of personal freedom than some of these other countries would. If these companies, for instance, were North Korean, they would probably be able to put quite a bit of limitation on their usage. But we have a tougher time with that conversation, and that's what we're trying to work out right now. State Department is really engaged in these discussions with the community. We could perhaps sanction some of the organizations that do this work in Saudi Arabia. We've done that before. There was an organization, the acronym was CSMARC, that was involved in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and we said we would sanction the organization. We made great moves to do it, and Saudi Arabia eventually just shut the whole organization down. But we know that some of those roles have been reconstituted, and if we sanction those, it makes it then impossible for U.S. technology companies to work with them, or for them to contract with providers of specialized capabilities. So that might be one step. It's sort of a simple step, but until we get to the bottom of what the government nexus with private sector is in terms of what we're allowed to allow and prohibit, that might be one of the easier ways to immediately address it.
Thank you so much. And with that, my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Mast, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you recognizing me. I've enjoyed hearing the debate and the conversation today. I think it's important. It's important to recognize important partners in every region that we work with, but it's also important for us as a nation and for our citizens who we are representative of, to never be allowed to be naive as to who it is that we're working with, and then we make an honest decision about how and where we will work with those individuals. And so it's in that I'm going to bring attention and I won't have any questions today. I just want to bring attention to something that a number of us have made requests for and worked on as it relates to Saudi Arabia, and bring it to the attention of some of the other members of our committee who have not been on this, and ask for your consideration on this. In the previous Congress, we did write a letter to Attorney General Barr to specifically express our concerns over a decision, or more than one decision, to assert what's known as the state secret privilege on litigation brought by victims of September 11 attacks, and their families against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I would like to basically ask that all members of this committee look into what is being considered under that state secret privilege, and that we write to Merrick Garland about the exact same issue, making sure that it is transparent for all Americans, not just what has gone on with a situation like Khashoggi, but what has gone on that has perpetuated the United States of America to be at war for 20 years, war that has, began on our soil, has affected many of us personally, me personally in war, many of my friends and family, and that we make every single effort to have very true and real transparency about all of those that we are working with. So in that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back my time. I know this is something that you have worked on as well, but just to say, I would ask for the support of members of this committee as we sit here and discuss Saudi Arabia, to also not lose sight of what is still being kept secret about September 11 to those that were most intimately affected by it. And in that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank you for your comments, Mr. Mast, and we'll yield 5 minutes now to Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Malinowski, I believe we're having some trouble with your sound. Now, why don't we give you a minute to work with staff to try to square that away? And we can't hear you. If it's okay with you, Mr. Malinowski, we'll go to Ms. Manning, and then we'll come back to you. Thank you very much. Ms. Manning, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing, and thank you to all the witnesses. I'm assuming you can hear me. Okay, great. Thank you to all the witnesses for their outstanding testimony. Ms. Fontenrose, you have articulated so clearly the complexity of our relationship with Saudi Arabia, including the importance of Saudi Arabia in the balance of power in the region and in achieving some critical U.S. goals. And your suggestion of setting clear red lines with actions for crossing those lines and the importance of acting in concert with the international community against human rights violations are all well taken, as well as your suggestion that the U.S. act as an avuncular advisor, which suggests a wonderful balanced approach. I'm interested in whether you can talk to us about whether there are carrots we can use in addition to sticks.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, there absolutely are. And I think that's incredibly important. If we only lead with sticks, then we risk losing some of the loyalty we have from Saudi Arabia to competitors, whether adversarial or friendly, whether economic or military. So in terms of some of the carrots, things like securing Saudi Arabia against the attacks they're receiving from Iran-backed proxies is a very immediate carrot. The end of our support for the coalition in Yemen did send a clear message to Mohammed bin Salman that there needs to be a political end to the war in Yemen very quickly. But it also did embolden greater kinetic action on the part of the Houthis. If we were to offer Saudi Arabia assistance with resisting those attacks, that is a carrot. They are looking for ways to push back that will not anger our Congress. They are very aware that if they use airstrikes, there will be condemnation from the Hill. So what are other ways that we can offer them? We can offer them cyber assistance. We can offer them electronic warfare assistance in addressing the guidance systems or the launch systems of the missiles and rockets that are coming at them. We can offer them assistance with assessing their vulnerability to drones and perhaps assistance in identifying which counter-UAS technologies might be most useful for them so they aren't just buying haphazardly from people pitching to them and acquiring technology that frankly won't be useful against the threat. We can work on intelligence sharing and identifying where those attacks are coming from. And then if the administration really wants to give them a carrot, the administration will talk to Congress and say, we have shared information on where these attacks are coming from. And we have told the Saudis it is okay for them to strike these launchers or these missile depots. And we would appreciate it if you would not condemn them for these particular targeted strikes against imminent threats. So there's some not very difficult and very immediate things we can do that are carrots. Other carrots include things like welcoming them back more robustly into the international economic community. They are really trying to rebuild their previous economic power. And our insistence that they be treated as a pariah has made the international finance community a little bit hesitant to do that. They would certainly welcome that sort of welcome into this conversation again, welcome back into that more robustly. That's not something we necessarily have to do, but that definitely would be a carrot. And that's simply diplomatic. That doesn't require policy changes. It doesn't require legislation. It doesn't require resourcing. Other carrots we can give them are consulting with them on the JCPOA. Yes, we've said that we would do that, but are we really taking into account their concerns about regional activities and missile programs from Iran would be a carrot for sure.
Great. Let me ask you one more question. Are there steps that the U.S. can take to encourage the normalization of the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel, to bring them into the Abrahamic Accords?
I don't even think we have to do much more. I think Mohammed bin Salman is on board with this. We are dealing with the fact that the current king of Saudi Arabia, who's been a wonderful partner to the U.S., is opposed to normalization until there is a political solution that is acceptable to the Palestinian camp. And it's my understanding that as long as King Salman is king, that stance will stay solid. That is essentially a core value in Saudi Arabia, and that we will see more direct movement on normalization, either if Mohammed bin Salman is made prime minister or if there is if there's a succession and Mohammed bin Salman were to take the throne, not necessarily upon the passing of King Salman, even prior, But I think that's where we're going to see it. I think pressure before then will still run up against the King Salman's personal beliefs and personal wishes. We might not want to press that from a longstanding great partner. But in the meantime, we can certainly work with Saudi on some things that they can do to show that normalization is coming. One is messaging to their own people. There's a big public diplomacy perception issue in much of the Arab world about normalization. They can start working on that right away. They can also start working on small economic agreements. They can start working on technical cooperation in areas of missile defense or maritime security. There are things they can do that are steps toward normalization without officially making that one of their policies that would help set the stage, would really put them in place, and then normalization would almost look like a logical completion of a process.
Thanks so much. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Manning. Before going to you, Mr. Burchett, we're going to take just a quick moment and see if Mr. Malinowski's audio works. No, unfortunately not. Maybe we can.
Mr. Chairman, if she comes back on, just stop me. It's good. I yield to the ladies. We're good.
We won't stop you. Hold on one second, Mr. Burchett. Mr. Malinowski, going to try one more time.
How about this?
Great. Okay, great. So, Mr. Burchett, we're going to go to you. Then we'll come back to Mr. Malinowski.
Mr. Chairman, I'll go back in bipartisan nature. Let's go back to Ms. Malinowski. She's had to skip her, and I'm cool with that. Okay.
No, that's actually very kind of you, but we went to Ms. Manning, who's a Democrat, and in keeping with our true bipartisan nature, we're going to come back to you now. If
all right, well, sorry, Tom. I tried, brother. I tried. I apologize, Tom. All right, Ms. Fontenrose, you mentioned in your testimony that we released Khashoggi reports too soon and missed out on additional human rights concessions. Which concessions do you think we missed out on?
It's my understanding from speaking with colleagues inside the kingdom that there was great concern in Saudi Arabia that the report might include incriminating information. And so they were keen to be very conciliatory prior to the release of the report. So it's my feeling that had the report release been delayed, we may have actually had leverage to make additional requests of Saudi Arabia. So we succeeded in the release of Loujain al-Hathloul, but she has peers who are still imprisoned, and it might have been possible to get some movement on those specifically.
Okay, and for the committee, is there any internal pressure on Saudi Arabia to improve its human rights practices? And that's out to anybody. Anyone? Ms. Fontenrose, you want to try that?
I apologize. I thought that question was for the committee. And can you repeat it really quickly?
It was, but since you're part of it, is there any internal pressure on Saudi Arabia to improve its human rights practices?
It's a great question because there's certainly pressure from the public who does believe that human rights improvements would improve their own lives. But that public has no leverage in Saudi Arabia. There is no mechanism by which they can express themselves in a way that will create policy change, but potentially not endanger them as individuals. So unfortunately, the pressure, the desire is there, but the pressure is not effective.
Okay, and this is for the committee, so y'all get ready to get on your buzzers. Did you think that Saudi Arabia would develop closer ties with their adversaries such as Russia and China because the U.S. pressured them on human rights?
Ms. Burchett, I think you're referring to the committee of witnesses. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm talking to the witnesses. I'm sorry. I'm not our committee. I don't want to hear any of y'all. I'm tired of hearing y'all. So go ahead.
I can speak to that. The answer is absolutely yes. We are the priority partner for Saudi Arabia. They are very clear about that, and we have no reason to doubt that. But it is definitely true that Russia and China bring their partnership without human rights strings attached. Russia would love to replace the U.S. as the hub for security relationships in the region. They've floated a proposal to this effect. that they continue to socialize, including in the recent visit of Lavrov to Riyadh. And China is very happy with the U.S. being the security guarantor and locking down its economic interests. We would not expect China to come in as a guarantor of Saudi security or a protector of waterways or the like, but they'll certainly replace us as a vendor of arms. And they'll also sell those arms to Saudi's enemies, which, you know, if you let Russia and China lead the way in terms of military technology in the region, you definitely have the kind of arms race that could lead to escalation. So yes, it's very real. Saudi would not like to go that way. They would not choose to go that way, but they do have other options.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to add briefly. I think that's true, but I think it should not be overstated. I think particularly when it comes to the rivalry with Iran, the partnership with the U.S. Is not replaceable by either Russia or China. They're not going to serve as that kind of bulwark against Iranian nuclear ambitions and regional ambitions. And so I think that the degree of preference for the U.S. is, we should recognize as strong and not be too quick to assume that any antagonism is going to lead them into the arms of Beijing or Moscow.
Great. Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time to Mr. Malinowski if he's figured out his computer. If he doesn't, tell him to get a 13-year-old daughter, because he will explain the everything you're doing wrong with your computer and embarrass you continuously with it. So I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. Mr. Malinowski, we are
How's
prepared
this?
to try again. We can hear you. Does your camera work?
It should be. Yes.
Oh, does everyone else see Mr. Malinowski? Only I don't. Is that?
I see Jerry.
Sorry, that's apparently the problem on my end. Mr. Malinowski, I want to also, as I acknowledge you, take just a moment to thank you for your principled and strong leadership on human rights, especially on human rights in Saudi Arabia. We're grateful for your leadership, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. And I think my daughter would probably give us the advice not to be using WebEx, but we'll set that aside for a moment. So look, I want to just jump right into what's been a really interesting exchange about leverage and our interest, and to start with Ms. Fontenrose, because in your testimony you made a proposal that is very consistent with what many of us have been advocating, and with what the Biden administration has actually begun to do, and that is to draw a red line around what could be called transnational repression, authoritarian states such as Saudi Arabia reaching beyond their borders into the United States, into democratic countries in Europe, into Canada, to pursue their enemies, which is essentially what happened in the Khashoggi case, but also others. At the same time, you expressed some concern about doing too much to go after the main author of the killing of Khashoggi, and I wanted to challenge you a little bit about an apparent contradiction between those two positions. I understand that there are limits to what the United States can do to challenge Saudi Arabia in terms of human rights conditions within the country. I want to try. I'm passionate about it, but that is, I think, somewhat different from the Khashoggi case. The Khashoggi case, yes, it's a human rights case, but it was also it was also something that can be considered a hostile act against a resident of the United States of America. And if we're going to have an actual red line, as you suggested, if we are going to build a coalition, an alliance of democratic states, making clear that we have zero tolerance for that kind of activity, don't we undercut that message if we say that a relationship with a particular individual in Saudi Arabia is too important to hold that individual accountable in any way?
Congressman, I don't think that what we'd be saying is that the relationship with that individual is too important. We'd be saying the relationship with the country too important, and we'd be acknowledging that because of the potential for retaliation by the individual at the top for certain actions, it would be in better serving U.S. interests not to take certain methods for responding to the Khashoggi murder. We are not without options. There are many, many options for U.S. response. So the issue is just assessing which of these will lead to the advancement of U.S. interests long term, and which would look like they were getting at Mohammed bin Salman, but would in fact be Pyrrhic victories. And so things like sanctioning him would definitely lead to retaliation against U.S. interests in many sectors, as I mentioned, even things like energy transition. And certainly it would cripple our ability to respond to post-conflict stabilization needs across the region when we do really count on Saudi Arabia writing checks. In 2018, the current coordinator for the Middle East on Biden's team at the NSC asked Saudi Arabia for $100 million to use in Syria. Without that money, we couldn't have accomplished some of what we needed to do there. And I guarantee you that Saudi Arabia is already considering the fact that that person will very likely come back and ask for more. We also are going to see needs in Iraq and in Lebanon, certainly in Yemen and Libya. And without one of the largest powers in the region in terms of resources and political weight, that would be very difficult to do on our own unless we want to get far more involved in these conflicts and in nations.
I understand. Sorry, I want to reclaim my time a little bit. What I worry about is that I mean, we have sanctioned the country. We just haven't done anything about the individual. And by sanction, I'm not in favor of economic sanctions against MBS for some of the reasons that you've laid out. What we have proposed is something that falls short of that. But I worry about the danger of reinforcing the official Saudi line, which is that the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was a crime, but it was committed by everybody other than MBS. They have sanctioned the same henchmen for the most part that we have sanctioned in the past. And I don't want to reinforce that lie. And I don't have that much time left, but I think a lot of the steps that you have suggested Saudi Arabia might take to harm our interests, if we take this step, would also be incredibly harmful to Saudi interests. Yes, China can sell them weapons. Yes, Russia can run around and propose regional security arrangements in which Russia takes part. But it's absolutely crystal clear that only the United States protects Saudi Arabia. Chinese weapons are useless to them because their own military is not what defends them. It is the United States military that defends them. If anything were to happen, an Iranian attack on Gulf shipping or on Saudi Arabia itself, the Saudi military would be asked to stand down, and the United States would be protecting the kingdom, and they know that. So wish we could continue the exchange, but I'm out of time and yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Stubbe, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are for Ms. Fontenrose. What posture should the U.S. take in its public statements about human rights and political freedoms in Saudi Arabia?
Excellent question. It actually allows us to follow up a bit on what Congressman Malinowski was raising as well. I think it's very important that the U.S. take very public posture for value of human rights. And I think this administration has already kicked it off very well by stating that. On the flip side, I think that the conversations about reactions to it need to happen privately because of the psychology of Mohammed bin Salman. And I encourage you to ask for briefings from your intelligence community liaisons on this if you'd like. This is best handled in a way that does not make him look like a public pariah. But the standards and the red lines should be stated publicly, and America's insistence on these being upheld should be stated publicly. There needs to be sort of this establishment of accountability, and then the methods by which we are willing to assist or the red lines we're drawing in terms of what the punishments will be can be private discussions.
Well, and kind of related to that, your policy recommendations include trying to have a positive influence on Saudi leaders through our engagement. Are there examples of ways in which our engagement with Saudi political or military leaders has had a positive impact on promoting America's values and policies?
Absolutely. Specifically on military, and this is a very tactical example, but the UN recorded a decrease in the loss of life by civilians in Yemen between 2017 and 2019 that we think is directly correlated to the advisement of our U.S. military to the cell that does deconfliction targeting in Yemen. We also know, as you mentioned, about the U.S. pressure resulting in the release of Lujain al-Hathlul. And I mentioned in my testimony the assistance by the State Department and the pressure from Congress that resulted in changes to Saudi curriculum that is used globally, worldwide. I think there are also additional ways that the U.S. can apply pressure diplomatically that would be well received. One is definitely staying on top of the call for the release of additional activists and dissidents. There are also we could ask, as I mentioned, for embedding of advisors into Saudi ministries to work on legislation, to work on the drafting of new laws and on codifying. We can recommend supporting them in their digitization efforts. We've placed pressure on them in terms of improving their human rights record, but we haven't really given them tools or said specifically how to do that. Saudi is really good about responding to specific requests, not so good about responding to generic requests, often because they simply don't know where to start. So if we provide some of the capacity and we say, all right, now that you've said inshallah and sort of shaken your head and said you're willing to come along, we're going to show you exactly how to get there, and we're going to walk you through this. I think it's very, very, very plausible.
In your testimony, you highlighted a trade-off between sanctions blocking access to the United States and enforcing other accountability measures against human rights violators. How would you recommend we resolve this trade-off in U.S. policy?
Can you repeat that one more time? I'm sorry, it's kind of broken.
Sure. In your testimony, you highlighted a trade-off between sanctions blocking access to the United States and enforcing other accountability measures against human rights violators. How would you recommend we resolve this trade-off in U.S. policy?
I don't think it has to be a trade-off. We could also choose to simply sanction businesses that Mohammed bin Salman has a stake in, and therefore avoid the trade-off issue becoming an issue at all. He is the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. He also holds many of the private sector companies in Saudi Arabia under his personal portfolio. And one of them, for instance, we know owned the planes that were used to transport the kill operation to and from Turkey. So we could choose to sanction businesses he's associated with instead of sanctioning him himself. And that might then lessen the risk of reducing U.S. access in the country and lessen the risk of retaliation and negate any trade-off.
Well, thank you for being here today. My time's almost expired, so I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stubbe, Mr. Keating, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we're looking at what we can do in terms of human rights concerns, and particularly the discussion centered on MBS and what we could do to look at the actions he's taken without compromising our policy, it's really interesting. I've been noticing on television, I think maybe some of the people here in the committee hearing have been noticing on television, the promotions, the tourist promotions that are much more extensive than they ever were for tourism travel into Saudi Arabia. And Mohammed bin Salman took his oil interests and transferred a great deal, billions of that, towards a Vision 2030, but also specifically on the tourism, the high-end tourism industry where the Red Sea development companies and other companies that he's been very involved with and controls, and to a large measure, pouring those billions of dollars into there. And the hypocrisy of these resorts and hotels and airports that he's upgrading and creating, and the rules that are there in terms of women wearing bikinis, or the serving of alcohol, or whether whether they can even unmarried couples can share rooms. Those things are like a for-profit hypocrisy to everything else they're doing in the country as well. So my question is, given his personal focus and investment on this, given the fact that in one end, he's really being hypocritical about many of the things he's doing, particularly the things he's doing to still allow, from the state standpoint, taking away human rights issues and in particular rights of women. What's going on the private side? Are you aware of any private groups or private citizen groups that are interested in these human rights issues, that are interested in what's being done to hurt women's equality there, whether there's advocacy groups, whether there's any acknowledgement of businesses that are having meetings there? Are you aware of what's going on the other side, the non-governmental side of approaching the violations for human rights that the Saudi government does by looking at these investments? Investments, by the way, that require participation from many of the countries who are working to make sure these norms no longer exist. Anyone?
I can talk a little bit about that. Well, the fact is, yes, there are a strong drive from the leadership towards creating something similar to the Dubai environment, a climate where really is global and open to tourists and international business, foreign business in particular. But it wasn't very successful because of the structural problems. We have seen increased fees on migrant workers, for instance. Migrant workers represent half of the workforce inside Saudi Arabia and a third of the population. Many of them do not really enjoy, the freedom to change jobs or to exit, but there were some reforms allowed for some segments of the workforce, not the domestic workers or the most vulnerable, to change their jobs or to leave the country without consent. So there are some policy problems to engaging foreigners inside Saudi Arabia. There are also more problematic issues when it comes to creating those futuristic cities. Those futuristic cities are aimed to be directed towards the foreign population rather than the local population. So it doesn't really change the situation for the local tribes. We have seen forced relocation in Neom, the futuristic city, for instance, of Al-Hawati tribes, in which several people were imprisoned, and one was killed for refusing the forced relocation. There are groups, private groups, of course, engaging in those issues. Some of them are from the people in exile, the Saudis in exile, who are meeting regularly with influential figures, influential groups. But one of the main hurdles that we face is the poor communication with officials. So these people do not have a channel of communication with their officials or with the officials who are visiting Europe and promoting these kinds of initiatives. So I would say, yes, there are private groups working towards improving the situation of human rights and highlighting those issues. But because of the atmosphere of repression inside Saudi Arabia, it is becoming more difficult for us to gather testimonies or to get information, real proper information on what's happening and who's most affected by these kinds of...
If I could interrupt, I'm sorry, but for instance, there's a French company that's doing massive investments in this too. We're sanctioning other companies and corporations in the world for other activities. This is a way the U.S. could approach it from a governmental standpoint, but also those of us that are concerned as U.S. citizens and people that are interested to do it in a private way. That was my point from the outside, because if we hurt this massive investment because of their actions in human rights and the way they treat women, then I think that might pressure him more instead of just the veneer of these cosmetic changes that he has made. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Dr. Jackson, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Is Representative Jackson still on?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you recognizing me. I think that most of the questions I had have already been answered at this point, so I'll yield back the rest of my time. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vargas, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank you for holding this hearing, and I particularly want to thank the witnesses for their important testimony. I also want to thank my good friend, Mr. Connolly from Virginia, for his leadership in pursuing justice for Mr. Jamal Khashoggi. But it does seem like we're in a very difficult place. We want to continue our important relationship with Saudi Arabia, and it also seems like the Saudi royal family seems to have picked Mohammed bin Salman as their future leader. So here we are. It seems like we have a very difficult time really treating the murder of Jamal Khashoggi as a murder, because we don't really believe in regime change. And if we try, we're not normally very good at it anyway. So here we are. We continue to make very strong statements about human rights, and I think we should, and certainly I believe in them. But it does seem that we're stuck in a very difficult place, treating this really like a murder because of the situation we're in. I mean, am I wrong about that, Mrs. Fontenrose?
You're absolutely right about that. That is exactly the cognitive dissonance we're facing right now. Is the king in Saudi Arabia has chosen Mohammed bin Salman as the next leader of Saudi Arabia, and Mohammed bin Salman has shored up his likelihood of succession. So then the U.S. must ask itself, what are our priorities in terms of not only the relationship, but what we want for years to come in terms of Saudi's role in supporting our objectives in the region and elsewhere? Can we work with this person? If not, what are our options? And they're fairly limited. If so, what do we need to do? What steps do we need to take to make sure that the direction of the kingdom is such that they are a productive and helpful partner, and not one that we are constantly having to turn around and rebuke and scold for massive foreign policy problems? And I think that's what we're talking about today, trying to find the ways that we can lead Saudi Arabia to this kind of change we're looking for. Because if he is the king and he does survive, as his predecessors have, then we'll be dealing with him for the next 10 presidencies.
Yeah, no, I agree. So in light of all that, I'd like to ask Dr. Aldosari. One of the things that I think is very, very important is obviously the issue of women's rights. And I've been to Saudi Arabia a few times myself on Codels, and it is glaring. I mean, it's obvious the lack of rights that women have. I mean, how can we push harder and at the same time not get people imprisoned and killed over this? I mean, I was surprised you open up the issue of driving for women, then you arrest the women that were pushing for women to drive. I mean, what can we do?
Exactly. So I would suggest that, the U.S. Uses its position as an ally, as a protector, to push for those reforms, to amplify the voices of the civil society and the women activists. The women activists did not only represent a voice for reforms. They were in a place where there is very limited support and resources available for most vulnerable groups. They were able to amplify their voices. They were able to, for instance, apply for a shelter for survivors of violence that is not very limited in terms of services and access, as the government-sponsored shelters. So I think that one key thing is to establish a good support or a good relationship with the civil society in Saudi Arabia. Mostly are in exile now. They're not really active from within. Even those who were released from prison are banned from resuming any kinds of activism. But at least with the civil society of Saudi Arabia, who are in exile outside, there is a National Assembly Party that has been formed last year by some of the scholars and activists in diaspora that is calling for a democratic transition and highlighting the issues from the point of view of the people. So having, an informed voices from the civil society, Saudi civil society, and try to amplify their demands for reforms and amplify their voices is a good first step to basically push for more reforms in Saudi Arabia that is based on public needs.
Well, I have to say again, I think that we have some leverage here because of this murder. I do think that, that MBS does care about his image. And I do think that we can do the things that you said, for women and the activists within and outside of the country by pushing harder and making our voice heard. Again, it's a very difficult situation, but it seems that's the situation that we're in. It doesn't seem like we have a whole lot of options. I see that my time has expired, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Schneider, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this committee. I want to thank the witnesses, and I'll start with you, Ms. Fontenrose, and I'm trying to figure out how to juxtapose two separate questions. I guess I'll start picking up what was discussed earlier about normalization. The Abraham Accords, the dynamic of things happening in the region around the world that are creating, I think, unique opportunities to promote naturalization. And certainly the United States has a role to play in fostering that. But also within Saudi Arabia, just curious, and to all the witnesses as well, have you seen any steps within Saudi Arabia for the regime to be laying the groundwork with their people towards moving closer towards normalization, and any sense of what the public might be willing to accept, or where the leadership might be willing to or able to move them to on what normalization might look like?
We have heard statements and rhetoric out of the Saudi government that are supportive of the Abraham Accords and supportive of the concept of normalization. It does appear that they are trying to prepare their population for the idea that Saudi Arabia should and could have a future relationship with Israel. There has not been any negative messaging out of Saudi Arabia about the accords from the official government. Now, this is different than what we're hearing about from some parts of the population. Saudi does have a fairly right-wing and conservative and anti-Israeli segment of their population that is of concern in terms of creating change too quickly in Saudi Arabia. What might their reaction be? But the government itself, yes, has been very pro-normalization in terms of their support for the idea that Israel could be a partner for peace.
Great, thank you.
I will just add one thing here. I'm
Please.
sorry to interrupt. That there is an intelligence sharing and cooperation with Israel. In fact, the software used to hack into Jamal Khashoggi's phone and other dissidents abroad was authorized by the Israeli Ministry of Defense and sold to Saudi Arabia and used in most of the hacking attempts. So I would say that there is already an ongoing relationship with the Saudi government and the Israeli government. But there is, of course, a very strong sentiment against any kinds of normalization from the people, not necessarily because they are conservative Islamists, not from an Islamic point of view only, but also from a point of standing with the Palestinians' rights of self-determination. This is not something that is mentioned in the accord, and this kind of individual normalization that would put no pressure whatsoever on Israel to solve the conflict with Palestinians. This is something that most of the rights groups in the region are against, and not only the Saudis.
All right, thank you for that. With the last 2 minutes to go in a slightly different direction, and Ms. Fontenrose, I'll point this initially to you. Very broadly, and this applies to everywhere, but we're focused on Saudi Arabia. How would you describe the implications for U.S. foreign policy and outcomes when we don't get the right balance on emphasis on human rights issues? And to be clear, that can be either putting too little or too much emphasis, although I have my own bias that there's no such thing as too much. What is the implications of not getting that balance right? I think we've lost Ms. Fontenrose. No.
Mr. Schneider, why don't you ask the question again?
All right,
thank
you. Ms. Fontenrose, can you hear me? I'm not sure we have audio connection. Are you able to hear me, Ms. Fontenrose?
I apologize. I lost power for a second there. Can I ask you to repeat that?
No worries. Yes, well, I'll repeat the question. What I was saying is that in foreign policy in general, but we're talking Saudi Arabia in specific, the delicate balance of the emphasis we place in our foreign policy on human rights. And, clearly it can be not enough emphasis, too much emphasis. I have my bias. That's not possible, but too much emphasis on human rights. But what are the implications for foreign policy for not getting the balance right?
I think there's no negative to stressing human rights. I think the balance we need to strike is in not being the only voice calling for them. We need to make sure that it's not simply an American request, but that this is an international request. We want Japan, we want Europe on side with us, saying that these are expectations of the global world order, and we're going to need you to raise your baseline to meet them, because otherwise we do risk isolating ourselves. true that we don't think any of these countries that we're talking to about human rights are necessarily going to jump into the arms of others in terms of their leading partners right away. But the more that we drive ourselves to a point where we're asking them to take great steps, you must sign on to this agreement that says that you will do certain maintenance and training and end user agreements. And we're going to put ethics training into our military sales, while other countries aren't doing that, makes us a more expensive and a more difficult partner. And we should not lower our standards, but we should be diplomatically pressuring our partners at the least to meet those same standards, whether it's in nuclear energy or whether it's on military ethics training, whatever it is. We shouldn't simply be focusing on the human rights violations. We should be focusing on the global voice that's calling for the rise in that standard.
Thank you. And I'll add, having the consistent message and engaging with our allies, not just here or there, but across the board is an easier way to do that. So I thank you. I went over time. Thank you, Chairman, for giving me the extra time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. I will now yield myself time for questioning. Thanks to all of the witnesses for your testimony. It's been a really good hearing. Dr. Aldosari, I want to focus on what you said in response to a recent question. We've had a lot of conversation today about the needs of Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince, about the needs of America. Obviously, the Saudis are, as we've discussed, the Saudis are concerned about Muslim Brotherhood. They're concerned about Iran. They have very real security needs. There is, as they look out to the future, there's talk of diversifying from oil. The Crown Prince's Vision 2030 was a bold idea. Women driving. There's a lot that the Saudis are thinking about and doing. And obviously, we spent this whole hearing talking about the importance of American values and human rights, and why we can't separate our pressing for human rights advances with recognizing the interests that we have in Saudi Arabia. But I want to focus, Dr. Aldosari, on what you said, which is the public needs. And in your conversation with Mr. Vargas, you talked about what happens when the government jails the same people that are now able to drive. They're jailed because of reasons that they're told have nothing to do with that. But when we look at the public needs going forward and the young people in Saudi Arabia, where does real reform in women's rights come in? How is it viewed? How important is it?
It's very significant now, and it's actually been recognized and acknowledged by Mohammed bin Salman and the government as a very important card, basically, to not only for the economy, but also for improving the image and meeting the youth needs, the youth demands. So as one of my colleagues mentioned, women's rights represent, a consensus, basically. The drive for women for more rights is a consensus across different religious and different ethnic groups and even different socioeconomic status. Women are now entering the military. So there have been advances, but the problem is, again, as I said, without people able to come together to express their needs and demands and to exposes what kinds of loopholes exist in the policies, it is going to be very difficult to sustain those kinds of reforms. For instance, the government said that they will enact, family laws, and they will codify the criminal law, soon. Those things will be launched soon. But we've seen other similar countries in the region, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait. They do have family laws, but it is very much institutionalizing the discrimination against women in the family and the power of the male guardians in most important decisions of marriage, divorce, child custody, and assets within marriage. So it didn't really relieve the pressure from women. So I would say having women activists coming together and being able to voice those concerns and basically being able to mobilize their community as they used to, so that to change the norms around certain issues is vital and key. And this is something that needs to be proven as well.
Let me just try to make this a finer point here, Dr. Aldosari. The changes that we've seen, the opening up to music, to dancing, things that we had been told we wouldn't see because of religious restrictions, we're now seeing. And it's important to young people. On the issue of all of how the laws around guardianship are viewed and interpreted, can we be hopeful that given the way young people have viewed the changes that have taken place already, that it is imperative that the government understand that there will have to be comparable changes there as well in the role of women?
I think it is understood by the government, but how much or how far they're willing to go, they're not really willing to basically dismantle this kind of power of men over women in the family. And it has been actually voiced out by Mohammed bin Salman in one of his interviews. He said, we do not want to challenge the family structure. And charges against the women activist is destabilizing the foundation of the Saudi society. And these are very broad terms, which basically comes to women trying to be equal to men in terms of legal rights. The fact that men still holds women, under their power by charges of disobedience and absence from home, just render all kinds of reforms and new rights granted to women useless, basically.
Thanks. And if it's okay with the ranking member, I'm going to yield myself just a little extra time to ask one more question. Thank you. Ms. Nossel, I want to ask you the same question with respect, same question about young people and the public needs of young people in Saudi Arabia going forward, but this time viewed through the lens of freedom of expression, of the rights of journalists, of bloggers. I mean, this is obviously we live in an age where the world is more interconnected than ever before. Young people understand what's the importance of that interconnectedness. So when you look at when you look at Badawi, you look at these other cases, isn't it? Can we see the needs of the public driving to such a point where our pressing for human rights and the government's need to acknowledge the demands of young people are going to coincide?
I think possibly, although, the government is sort of, playing this game of trying to, and it's a playbook, that I think the Chinese have really perfected, which is that you open up on music and entertainment and social media, but within very strict parameters, and that opening, gives people the sense that they are able to communicate, take advantage of these technologies, enjoy some of the rewards. But anytime it verges toward actual dissent or organizing or the expression of independent political opinion, that's where the buck stops, and the system is tightly controlled. I think in Saudi Arabia, we do see this kind of bleeding over between the activist core and a much wider public opinion. And it's evident in the area of women's rights, as Dr. Aldosari said, where it has become a consensus viewpoint. You have this crucible of activists who put themselves on the line and paid an incredibly high price in giving up their freedom to be on the forefront of that campaign. But then you see, scores of Saudi women across, socioeconomic, professional, religious and geographic lines supporting it, and that has driven the government towards some change. So I think we have to be optimistic. I think we have to believe that in the long arc, and I think that's important when we think about the outcome after the murder of Khashoggi. Whether in a few years, 4 years, 8 years, we'll be able to say that there was substantial movement. And I think, if there is, I believe, even if we can't see this mass pressure for free expression across Saudi Arabia, it is there. I believe free expression is a universal drive and hunger that people have, and we saw it in Saudi with the burgeoning of social media, over the last several years, now more repressed. So I think ultimately, yes, although we shouldn't necessarily expect clear signs of that in the short term.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And just invoking the word optimism in today's hearing, I think is very much appreciated. And as Ms. Fontenrose points out, should things go the way they're headed now, and ultimately the Crown Prince becomes the king and is the king throughout 10 presidencies. Thank you for putting it in bold terms like that, Ms. Fontenrose. There is a reason that we need to continue to press on human rights, because this is a long game, and America's voice is critically important as we recognize both the importance of the relationship and most importantly, the importance of our values and human rights in advancing that relationship. So to all of the witnesses, I want to say thank you for a really informative and interesting conversation. I want to thank the members for participating, and I want to thank the staff for pulling off a relatively seamless virtual hearing. Thanks to all of them as well. Ranking Member Wilson, thank you for your leadership. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.